Whispers of the past, a love that never fades. The elderly woman took slow, measured steps towards the park bench, relieved to finally sit down and catch her breath. The autumn sun cast a golden glow, but the crisp breeze made her grateful for her thick coat. She carefully placed her handbag on her lap. "Good morning," said the silver-haired man sitting at the other end of the bench. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Martha smiled. "It is. A bit chilly, though." The man folded his newspaper and returned her smile. "I'm Edward." "Hello, Edward. I'm Martha." She adjusted her scarf, her aged fingers trembling slightly in the cold. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, gazing over the cityscape below. "I've always loved this view," Edward finally said. "Pardon?" "The view," he repeated. "I used to come here as a boy to watch the trains." Martha followed his gaze down the hill. "I always preferred the steam trains," he added. "Do you see?" "Yes, I do. No more steam trains now, though. It was a different time." Edward nodded. "It certainly was. I used to travel all over. My parents never really knew where I was. It wasn't like it is now." He hesitated. "Do you have children?" "Yes, 2. And grandchildren, too." "Then you're lucky. What are their names?" Edward turned to look at Martha, noticing her well-worn features and the long silver braid resting on her shoulder. "Benjamin is the eldest. He has 2 children of his own now." Martha smiled with pride. "Though they're not so little anymore. They've grown up and moved away. I don't see them as often as I'd like. I've always liked the name Benjamin." Martha chuckled. "And then there's Margaret. She finally got married last year, nearly 60. But she found the right one in the end." "Well, that's wonderful." "It was. She looked absolutely radiant." Edward leaned back. "I always wanted children." A quiet moment passed between them. Martha glanced over. "You can read your newspaper, Edward. I don't mind." No, it's fine. I don't often get the chance for a chat, especially not with a lovely lady." He gave her a playful wink. Martha laughed. "Oh, a charmer, I see. I bet you broke a few hearts in your time." "I wouldn't say that." "Did you grow up around here?" "Yes," Edward replied. "Not far. Went to school here, too. It was called Calder something." He shook his head. "I can't quite recall." "Age does that to us, doesn't it?" Martha said gently. Edward shrugged. "I suppose so." She sighed. "It takes away the most precious things. Our strength, our minds, our memories." They sat in silence again, both lost in thought, watching the world go by. "May I ask you something, Edward?" He turned to her. "Of course." "Did you ever marry?" Edward shook his head. "No, I never did. There was someone once, long ago. I can't remember her name." He frowned slightly. "What about you?" "Yes, I married my best friend, the love of my life." "Well, that's truly special." "It was." Her voice softened. "But I lost him, and it's been terribly lonely ever since." Martha lowered her gaze to her lap. Edward reached over and gently took her hand. "I'm so sorry. How long has it been?" "About 5 years now. Nothing has felt the same since." Her faded blue eyes filled with unshed tears, clouded by sorrow and time. Edward frowned. "That's heartbreaking. Do you have anyone close by?" Martha shook her head. "They have their own lives now. Benjamin is in Chester, Margaret in Manchester. And it feels like all I do is cross names out of my address book." She hesitated. "All of my friends. They're all gone." Edward reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded handkerchief, and offered it to her. "Here now, it's all right." Martha managed a small smile. "Thank you." She dabbed at her eyes. "I must look a sight, sitting here crying like an old fool." Not at all. Well, I certainly feel like one. I should be grateful for what I have. I'm still here. My children are happy and healthy. You were right. I've been lucky. Edward looked puzzled. What? A moment ago, you said I was lucky to have my children. Oh, yes, that's right. He shook his head. I'm getting more forgetful these days. Martha tried to return the handkerchief, but Edward waved it off. Keep it. I have plenty. All right, thank you. She tucked it neatly into her handbag. Snapping it shut, she sighed. Life is strange, isn't it? Edward tilted his head, unsure what she meant. How so? I just can't believe I'm here, at this stage of life. And what do I really have to show for it? Edward didn't answer. I don't feel any different than I did 10, 20 years ago. And yet, when I look in the mirror, an old woman stares back at me. She exhaled slowly. It all seems so fleeting. Edward cleared his throat. I'm not sure what to say to that. I know, Edward. I wasn't really expecting an answer. I just needed to say it. Silence settled between them again. I used to take the trains, you know. Traveled all over. Yes, you mentioned that. Edward chuckled. I did? Martha smiled fondly. Yes, and you said your parents never knew. Not a clue. It was a different time. No, Edward, it's not like today at all. Edward turned to her with a thoughtful expression. You know, you look familiar. Have we met before? Martha sighed. Yes, we have. Edward frowned, trying to place her. And it's time we went home. This cold is settling into my bones. Edward still looked uncertain. Come on now. I've got a casserole in the oven. And then it's time for the horse racing. You like the races, don't you? She stood stiffly and held out her hand, offering him a warm smile. Come on, Edward. It's time to go home. Edward hesitated, then slowly nodded and stood. Don't forget your newspaper. The elderly couple strolled away from the park bench, where they had sat every Sunday morning for the past 50 years, hand in hand, heading back to the house where they had built a life together. Empty now, Martha thought, as she led her husband home. So very empty.